All right, so now that Steve has taken our audience and split them up into their own individual geometry containers, we can easily come in and add our rim lights and then link up the correct association between geometry container and light. But we'll come back to these rim lights in just a bit. In this video, we're going to focus on the creation and parameter settings of main spotlight 1 and main spotlight 2. Let's go ahead and jump over to the whiteboard for a quick review. Let's come down to the appropriate layer. If you guys recall, main spotlight 1 and main spotlight 2 will serve as real spotlights, like in the real world when you go to watch a performer up on a stage and you have spotlights that are being driven by, it could be mechanically driven, like by a robotic system, or by an actual employee up there that's, controlling the rotation of the light. In this particular case, we're going to set up a very simple system where we will have two nulls down here at the bottom. And the reason we're going to have two nulls is because we don't want for these two lights to be shining directly on top of one another, casting only a single circular area of illumination. By having the two nulls, they can provide an offset for one another. But we will have the characters translate X drive the nulls, translate X in motion. But as far as translate Y goes, we're going to keyframe that manually. And it makes sense for the simple fact that our character down here is jumping up and down. We don't want for these lights to be moving up and down, tracking our character, because then the illumination that will be cast on the floor will look kind of odd. So to avoid that, we'll just manually keyframe it in ourselves. So we're going to make sure that these two lights, as mentioned back in the introduction to the lighting section, will be placed high in the air so that they can cast illumination on our character all the way over to the ladder, up the ladder, and then out onto the diving board. And then as our character dives into the diving board, I'd like to bring your attention to the following. This light's going to be pointing in this direction here, which will cast some illumination over here onto our audience. Same thing goes for this light. It'll be pointing in this direction towards our pool. And as our character is going down, illumination will be applied to this part of the stadium as well. Why is this important? Well, we're going to also set up our shadows in this video. And when we set up our shadows, we're going to need to pay very special attention to these areas here because we will be using depth map shadows, and we do not want for jagged shadows to appear back here. We do not want for whoever is watching the animated short in the end to have their attention broken away from our character who's just jumped off and quickly look back there at the audience because something feels wrong. And what I'm referring to are the blocky shadows. So we'll have to keep that in mind. That's just a quick look at what's going to be done. With that, I'll hand it over to Steve. Steve, it is now yours.
Fantastic. So I'm going to jump into Houdini, and let's first get our main spot 1 set up. So jumping over into Houdini, I'm going to create a new spotlight. And I'm going to push Enter to create that at the origin, and space 2 to switch over to a top view, W to take a look in wireframe. I'm going to grab the handles controlling the position of our light. I'm going to offset him down in Z, and then over in X, matching roughly where we had him drawn over here on the whiteboard. And with him positioned in X and Z, I'm going to switch over to a front view with space 3. And I'm going to move him up in Y, way up above our ladder, somewhere around.
Yeah, that looks pretty good.
So this means that when our ball climbs up onto the ladder, he'll still be receiving illumination, and more importantly, he won't be getting any shadows cast by the fact that we've got the diving board and the pole and the ladder in the way, whereas if the spotlight was down here casting up, all of this would cast shadows and our ball wouldn't actually receive any illumination from
That's
them.
right.
So with that positioned up in the correct location, we do want to rename him to main spot 1.
Okay.
And then I want to go ahead and create the null that this guy is going to look at and follow. So this is going to be very similar to when we set up the null for our audience look at, in as much as we're going to average out the Y position, so we won't have all the subtle bounces, but we will move up in Y when our ball climbs the ladder. But unlike the audience look at, we're going to follow more closely with the character's actual position, because our spotlights do need to still aim up here, whereas we didn't want our audience to look all the way up here because they'd be leaning back far too far.
Yeah, it looked kind of odd.
So I'm going to create a new null, and I'm going to rename this null to spot look at A. And I'm going to set up a relationship on translate X such that we follow our character's position. So let's grab our character's TX parameter, and we can see as we scrub that our null will follow the character in X. I'm going to give a small amount of offset in Z, because if you recall, we're going to have two nulls, one for main spot 1 and one for, excuse me, one for main spot 2, and we want to have those slightly offset from each other. So I'm going to give this a very small offset in Z of something like minus 0.5. And then we're going to set up and key our animation on Y. So I'm going to start roughly center to the character, and I'm going to keep that constant until we ascend the ladder. So let's come over here to around that bounce, and Alt left click on Translate Y to key Translate Y. And then I'm going to turn on Auto Key so that when we move our null in Y, we'll be creating keyframes on the Translate Y parameter. So I'm going to scrub until our character has climbed up the ladder. And once our character's made it to the top of the ladder, I'm going to move up in Y to around the character's position, noting again we've got another keyframe created on Translate Y. We're going to hold this until the character moves to the end of the diving board, so right around here. And I'm going to Alt left click on Translate Y to key that again. And then as the character starts jumping, I'm going to approximately match the motion of the character. So we'll move up to the peak, down to the bottom of the jump, up again to the peak, down to the bottom of the jump, and on this final one we'll find the peak of the jump, so right around there, and then scrub until our character hits the bottom of the pool.
Look at the cheering crowd.
Woo.
That's just great.
And let's find the frame where the ball impacts with the pool. So there we go. I'm going to translate this in Y right down to meet with the character. Now we're most likely going to need to modify our animation curve, because if we scrub this back a few frames, you can see that we're not following with our ball due to the curve of the animation. So I'm going to shift middle click on Translate Y.
Let's also take a look at what happens as the ball is jumping up and down on the diving board as well.
Okay.
See how well it's tracking along.
Sure. So I'm going to just modify these tangents until our null is closely following our character's position. And hopefully then if we scrub back and forwards, we're going to be following our character much more closely.
Yeah,
so yeah, let's take a look at the animation up on the diving board when he's bouncing. So there's that bounce. So yeah, we're a little bit too floaty.
Yeah, coming back down especially.
So let's shift middle click on Translate Y. I'm going to home up. And I'm going to create tangents much like we saw with the character's animation. Yeah. So I'm going to grab this tangent handle, shift select this tangent handle and this tangent handle, untie those, and then let's... Oh, that one didn't get untied. Let's make sure we actually grab the tangent handles and untie those. And just give this more of an animation curve matching our actual character's animation. So something like... that will match much more closely to what our character was actually doing. So, bounce. That's a little bit too quick on the acceleration there, so let's step back a few frames. We can scope this up, home up, and we can see that we're dealing with this portion of the curve, so I can simply modify the tangents, moving the keyframe, bringing off the weight, etc., just to... I'm basically modifying our curve but keeping an eye on the viewport as to the position of the null, just to get it a little bit closer to the character, so hopefully that will...
Yeah, much better.
More closely match. And
keep in mind, again,
fantastic.
We're simulating people actually controlling these lights, so it's not going to be perfect. You don't want it to be perfect.
Exactly, because they're not going to know exactly where the character's going to be at any moment in time. But yeah, that's going to serve perfectly for what we need. So I'm going to move back to where the character is stationary at the start, so we can start looking at the actual spotlight parameters itself. So first thing, we need to set up our spotlight to look at this null. So I'm going to grab our spotlight, and on the transform tab, under the look at options, I'm going to bring up the browser and grab our spot look at a null. And that's going to make our spotlight look at that null object. And if we were to render this now, we're going to notice a few things need changing with some of our light
Actually,
parameters.
go ahead and back away a little bit because the cone angle is going to be pretty big.
Yeah, pretty large. So let's give this a render. I clicked on the render view button. And you can see we've got a very large cone angle. And I would really like to see a tight ring of light around our character. So let's switch over to our light tab. And we're going to leave the light color set to white because we want the ability to have full control over these lights if we so wish in post. So I'm not going to set a light color now.
Now, that's not to allude anyone to us making a change to the color here and then losing control over in the compositor. It just makes it much more difficult.
You do still have control because you can still multiply colors and change the colors. But if you have a white light color, then you're going to have the full spectrum of light effectively being cast, which means we can then cast that light over to any color we wish. If we've only gone and emitted red light, then we're going to be very hard to push that light into blue because none of the blue properties of the material are going to be reflecting any light, so we're not going to pick up on those.
That's right.
So by emitting white light, we have the biggest range of control over in post. We're also going to emit diffuse light and specular light because this is one of our main lights for the scene, so we want to see specular highlights coming off of our character being cast by this spotlight. Coming down we can see our cone angle, and a cone angle of 45 with the cone delta, that's the angle between fully illuminated and the outside of the spotlight's cone. You can see that these were giving us a large cone, and we want to narrow that down. So I've found values of 7 and 2 for the cone angle and cone delta give us much nicer results. If I re-render the view, we can see that's now a much tighter circle of light around our character with a very small angle of fall off.
And if you're thinking, wait a minute, I need some more illumination, let's just keep in mind that we're about to duplicate the light so that we have 2 spotlights shining down on this guy, and where the 2 lights do overlap with one another, we're going to be adding the light together, making a more strongly illuminated character.
Cool. So while we're dealing with our light, let's go ahead and set up our shadows for the light. And we're going to use depth map shadows because depth map shadows will render much more quickly than ray trace shadows. And with spotlights, it's very easy to set up depth map shadows that work very nicely because we have that focused area of light, which means we're going to have a focused area where we're getting a shadow cast.
The grid's going to be pulled across that, which is nice, which means if you render right now, we'll end up with probably fairly decent looking shadows.
In this particular situation, yeah, because the character is the only thing casting a shadow. He's close to the floor, so he's just casting a very nice crisp shadow. It's hard to see. There are some shadowing artifacts on the character itself caused by self-shadowing, and the easiest way to demonstrate this spotlight's going to cast shadows on everyone. So we can scrub forward until the point where it would be casting a shadow on the diving board. When the diving board is bent, we're going to easily be able to see the self-shadowing artifacts that are actually cropping up. Because while they're not so evident on the character as to really be a problem, when we get to the diving board, let's wait for it, a frame where it's really bent down, somewhere like here, and we're to render this out, we're going to see very evident self-shadowing.
You're going to see a bunch of
just
dark
basically little
speckles.
Yeah, speckles.
And that is self-shadowing. And it's actually very easy to fix.
Very easy to fix. So you can see all these small dark speckles, and again, on the character.
Yep.
This is coming from the object self-shadowing itself. We have a shadow bias parameter on the shadow parameters, and that allows us to offset those depth values that are in the depth map so that we can get rid of this self-shadowing. So I'm going to boost this from 0.05 to 0.2 and re-render our view. And by increasing that bias, we're going to eliminate all of the self-shadowing issues that we were having occurring. Now we do want to make sure that any shadows we're casting onto our audience are also being cast in such a way that we're not getting blocky shadows. And we're only going to see our audience from around this kind of distance. So I'm going to position our camera up somewhere around here. We can see our light is casting around onto the audience about here. So let's render, and we should see a cone of light with our character and the ladder casting a shadow. So let's just give
another thing that you need to watch out for when using shadow bias is that you do not separate a shadow too far away from the geometry.
Yeah, and we can jump back to nearer the start where it's very clear to see our character sat on the floor, and we can see that we're still getting shadows that look correct. But we can see the shadow being cast here. We don't seem to have any shadowing artifacts, and this looks very nice and crisp, so that's working perfectly. So I'm going to switch back to the start of the animation and take a look at the shadows here now that we've increased that shadow bias, just to make sure that everything is looking correct. Just give this a second to render. So yeah, there we go, everything's still looking great. There's one final thing I want to do before we've wrapped up the first of our 2 spotlights, and that's to key its intensity, because in our shot 2 we're looking at the character, and the character's going to breathe in, and before he starts breathing in, those main spotlights are going to be off, and over a couple of frames they're going to kick on, the character's going to breathe in and start his performance. So at around frame 221, I'm going to go over to the light intensity on the light tab for our spotlights parameters, and I'm going to key this with a value of 0 by alt left clicking. I'm then going to step forward 2 frames to 223 and key this with a value of 1. So over those 2 frames, we're now going to go from having no illumination from those spotlights to having our full illumination for the rest of the animation. So that's going to set up our main spotlight 1. What I'm going to do now, we can Control-C, Control-V this guy to create a duplicate, and he'll come over with all of the settings we've already set up. Then we can set up a second null for that new spotlight after we've repositioned him, and get him to look at that null, and then that will wrap up this video. So I'm going to Control-C on our main spot, Control-V to create main spot 2. And let's reposition him, which if we saw on the whiteboard, is over on the other side of the stage, more towards the center of the stage. So I'm going to grab the spotlight and right click on its handle and align the handle to world, so that we can move this simply on X and Z plane and not worry about changing this spotlight in Y. And let's move him over to this side of the stage, and you'll notice we'll throw up a warning. Well, it said about the look at object being disabled. That's fine, we're going to set up a new null anyway. And that's a warning that will always crop up when you move a spotlight after having told it to look at a particular object.
So just jump over to
the top view just to make sure we're... So something like that, maybe a little
bit back to the right, yeah.
Something like that would probably work out fantastically. We're still maintaining that high altitude in Y. So I'm going to take our look at null that we've already got, and instead of creating a new null and having to animate the null to follow our translate Y, what I'm going to do is simply create a null that is offset relative to this guy by using parenting. So I'm going to right click on the output of our spot look at A null. I'm going to create a new null, left click on that to select it, enter to drop it into our network, and I'm going to rename this to spot look at B. And I'm going to offset this null just a little bit relative to our existing null. So I'm going to offset this in X, maybe just back a small amount, offset down in Y a small amount, and then offset in Z over, let's go this way because the other null went that way, let's offset over a small amount. So our 2 nulls are now offset from each other. And with that null in place, we can come over to main spot 2, and we can tell main spot 2 on the transform tab with its look at options, we can say look at, and grab our spot look at B. So now this spotlight's going to focus on that null, our other spotlight's going to focus on our first null. As our character moves around, both spotlights are going to track him. So with that in place, let's do a quick render to see how this is looking now we've got the overlapping circles of light. Wait for Houdini to render. There we go. So that's working out fantastically. We're getting specular highlights on our character. We're getting really nice shadows from both of the spotlights. And we're getting those nice overlapping rings of light with our high intensity where they overlap, and then moderate intensity either side.
Excellent.
Cool. So with that, that's going to wrap up setting up our main spotlights. Thanks a lot.